happy to share some of the insights of a historian, which is, of course, how I came to study this topic, trying to understand the key trends in world economic history, international politics, and the rise of big tech firms. And my argument that I'd like to put forward to you today, and which I put forward in Ship War, is that you cannot understand the modern world without putting semiconductors at the center of your analysis, and that you cannot understand the semiconductors today without putting TSMC at the center of the story. And so it's a delightful opportunity for me to have a chance to speak to so many people from TSMC and from all of Taiwan's semiconductor industry line here in Taiwan. I'd like to begin with the origins of the modern computing industry, even before the first integrated circuits were invented. There's now 100 people in this room holding up their smartphones, but it wasn't so long ago that computing power needed to make a smartphone work was inconceivably large. Indeed, the first computers that were devised were the size of entire rooms, and the computing capability on them were a tiny, tiny fraction of the computing capabilities in smartphones. The earliest computers that were devised were used by governments for espionage capabilities and for military development. Here's one famous computer, allegedly part of the UK, that was used to crack codes during World War II, or the ENIAC computer in Philadelphia, designed in the late 1940s to guide artillery shells toward their target. Computing power at first was something that's only accessible to governments because it required vast space, huge expenditures, extraordinary energy consumption. It was simply too large, expensive, unwieldy for consumers to take advantage of. And so it took a long time for the process of miniaturizing computing power to be developed in a way that would make it fit into your smartphone. The chip industry emerged actually from the Cold War arms race. The US military was one of the key drivers of the miniaturization of computing power. We wanted to guide a missile to its target, they found out. The best way to do it was to make a very small computer, put it in the nose cone of a missile, and use that to direct missiles like this one pictured here, the Minuteman II ICBM, which was one of the first large-scale orders for integrated circuits in the 1960s. But the process of miniaturization, of taking transistors and making them smaller and smaller and smaller, so more and more of them could be fit on a given piece of silicon, began to take off, just like the rockets that they were guiding the industry took off in the 1960s, and it set itself on a course of miniaturization that continues all the way to this day. And that pattern of miniaturization is often known as Moore's Law, and after Gordon Moore coined the term in the 1960s, and it's led to the discovery of ways to make transistors that are today the size of a virus in their smallest versions. And so although the first commercially available semiconductor had just 4 transistors on it in the early 1960s, today if you buy a new smartphone, just the primary chip on that phone will have billions, 10 billion, 15 billion transistors on it. And there's nowhere in the world economy that has seen such extraordinary progress, doubling capacity every 2 years or so for now over half a century. I think the rest of the sectors of the economy and the progress that they've made. I like to imagine, for example, what the world would look like if planes flew twice as fast every 2 years. We'd now be approaching the speed of light when it came to aircraft travel, but in fact, we're far, far from that rate in almost any other sector. The chip industry has delivered that because it's learned how to miniaturize components and, no less importantly, do so in a commercially viable way. Now, the science of miniaturization has been hard, but the commercial viability, I would argue, has been even harder. And in many ways, the success of the companies that have defined the industry is due as much to their technological capabilities as it is to their business model and their business acumen. So I think it's important when we think about the future of technology to ask not only which countries or companies will produce the most advanced devices, but also which ones can produce them efficiently, sell them profitably, gain the revenue that's necessary to invest in the next generation of automobiles. That's been as critical to the chip industry as any sort of technological advances. We have, of course, Nobel Prizes for physicists and chemists who create new devices that can then be commercialized later on. We don't have a similar prize for brilliant business people that have driven the semiconductor industry forward. And I would posit to you today that if such a prize did exist, several people in this room would be worthy recipients of that prize. Because I think that the business people who have made the semiconductor industry what it is are in some ways just as important in shaping the industry as the Nobel Prize winners who have provided the basic research behind it. Now, what I'd like to suggest to you today is that the fact that we're having this conversation here in Taiwan is something of a surprise. If you would ask someone in the semiconductor industry in 1960 or 1970 to project which country would have the most advanced process technology half a century later, I think few people would have guessed that Taiwan would be the answer. And the trajectory of the chip industry from its origins in Silicon Valley and in Texas in the United States to its current state where Taiwan plays an absolutely critical role is partly due to structural factors and Taiwan's policymaking and shifts in the global economy, but also, as historians like to point out, there's structural factors, but there's also individuals who shape the industry in profound ways. Now, as I mentioned, when the chip industry was in its early years, it was the defense sector that consumed most of the chips that were being produced, but that quickly began to change as companies like Texas Instruments, which was the company to first invent the integrated circuit, Fairchild Semiconductor in California, the company was second to invent the integrated circuit, began to realize that missile guidance systems weren't the only use for their devices. Corporate computers, then pocket calculators, there were a whole set of new devices that began to be transformed by the application of computing power. And that speaks to a third facet of the industry's growth over time. There's technological advances, there's business acumen, but there's also visionary product design. It was far from inevitable that someone would have thought of putting chips inside of phones or chips inside of cars when they were invented in the late 1950s and early 1960s. And it's taken a visionary set of product designers to envision new ways to deploy computing power, to begin to transform our economy in the way that chips have. And I think if you look back at the history of the industry, you see development not only defined by types of technology, transistor design, for example, types of tools used to produce transistors, nor is it only defined by the companies that have played a big role in mass producing chips. It's also defined by use cases of the technology. And what we've seen over the past several decades is that every decade or so, there's a new use case that comes online, provides a vast new source of demand for semiconductors, and illustrates the ways in which they will continue to transform economy and society as well. I mentioned that the first use of semiconductors was for defense applications, then they were corporate computers, was one of the main end markets, pocket calculators, PCs after that, smartphones more recently, and finally today we're in a new wave of semiconductor demand driven by the desire to apply artificial intelligence, both in vast data centers and on the edge of networks, which is driving semiconductor demand and changing society and economy in the process. And that's the third facet that I think is critical to emphasize, the new use cases that have driven the industry forward. So how was it that Taiwan became the center of the world's chip industry? Today, as many of you are well aware, it's in Taiwan that 90% of the world's most advanced processor chips are produced. I calculated that over 1/3 of the new computing power the world adds each year comes from Taiwan. It's an extraordinary ascent for an island that just 50 years ago was a small player in the world's chip industry. Now, there's some structural factors at play, as I mentioned. From the earliest days of the chip industry, there was a desire to build assembly facilities in parts of East Asia. On this image right here, you can see behind the jump sailing through Kowloon Bay, a building with an F on its exterior. That's an F for Fairchild Semiconductor, one of the first companies in Silicon Valley's chip industry and the first semiconductor company to open a facility in East Asia, in this case, in Hong Kong in 1963. So from the early days of the industry, the first integrated circuit was invented in 1958. Just 5 years later, there were supply chains already beginning to crisscross the Asia-Pacific region. But to understand Taiwan's unique role, we need to go back to the history, I would suggest, of Texas Instruments. great pleasures I had when I was researching this book was not only interviewing well over 100 executives, scientists, government officials who worked in the semiconductor industry, but also spending some time in the historical archives of several critical semiconductor companies. And in the early stages of my research, I spent some time digging through the files of Texas Instruments, which donated many of its early papers to Southern Methodist University in Texas. And I stumbled early in my research on a very interesting document from 1976 that I'd like to share with you today. This is a document from a strategic planning conference in 1976 in March with a number of individuals, some of whose names you probably don't recognize, but one of whose names you probably do. And it seems to me when I was reading this document that already in the middle of the 1970s, we see the origins of the foundry business model that would transform the entire semiconductor industry and put Taiwan at the center of the map. And so I'd like to share with you just briefly several quotes from this document to argue